Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at the Artificer Xy'mox encounter in Castle Nathria.
Yes, I've been looking forward to talking about this one because this fight is awesome. It's easily one of my favourite encounters in the instance. It's like a perfect example of how bosses don't need to have a massive list of meaningless mechanics and abilities to make them fun or challenging. Instead, this one has very few, but all have a massive impact on how the fight plays out and how they interact with one another. So anyway, let's jump straight in.
So the most important ability for you to understand is the Dimensional Tear. This debuff is placed on two players pretty frequently and lasts for 8 seconds, and when it expires it will spawn a wormhole on the location of each player, and each wormhole is linked, so entering one will make you appear out of the other. This is vital as it's the counter to so many mechanics in the fight. Positioning is quite important for these wormholes, but for the most part as long as one is near the raid and the other is far away as it can possibly be, you should be fine. So we decided to keep the boss on the right hand side of the room and place one hole nearby, whilst the other would always be placed as far to the left hand side as that player could possibly go. So what are these wormholes used for? Tanks are debuffed with Glyph of Destruction. This deals ticking damage over 4 seconds until it explodes, dealing massive raid-wide damage that drops off with distance. So whilst you could just run away or leap away from the raid, using the portal is going to reduce the damage to its absolute minimum if both of them are placed well beforehand. Once the explosion's gone off, the tank will also be debuffed afterwards, which increases the arcane damage they take by 50% for 45 seconds, and this does stack, so you've got to make sure that you taunt off each other after each glyph. Now from the pool until the boss reaches 70% health, the raid has to use the wormholes for the fleeting spirits. The boss will spawn these near players and shortly afterwards they'll fixate on random targets for 12 seconds until they despawn. They start off quite slow, but they do pick up the pace quite drastically. If you're hit by one of these guys, you're possessed and your raid team will have to damage you to free you. So for the first 30% of the boss's health, we found it important to be pretty close to the portal, but not too close, which we'll touch on in a minute, but close enough so that you can actually have time to react to being fixated by the ads and reach the wormhole before the ads reach you. After teleporting through, you can teleport back, but not immediately, as there is a 3-second grace period which prevents you from teleporting back and forth in some sort of endless loop. From 70% to 40% boss health, you'll no longer get the ads, but instead you'll get seeds. When we first tested this, it was only 4 of them, but it has since been changed in the dungeon journal to 8 of them. These will spawn in set locations throughout the room and will slowly tick down with a bomb detonation display above them. When they explode, they deal lethal damage to all players within their massive targeting circle. You can however pick them up and move them and place them back down on the ground using your extra action button. So we decided to have players ready to pick them up in their preset locations, move them to the far side of the room and then use the portals to come back to the raid. Whilst you're also within this health window, the boss will also debuff random players with Withering Touch. This long duration debuff does insane ticking damage, which forces healers to pretty much spot heal any players that have it for the entire duration. So we always made sure that we had a healer stick with the bomb placing group just to make sure no one died from the debuff.
Now from 40% onwards, the boss will no longer spawn seeds or do the nasty debuff, and instead will spawn a sword in the middle of the room that will occasionally cast Edge of Annihilation. This deals raid-wide damage whilst dragging the entire raid towards the sword, with the dragon effect becoming progressively stronger over the cast. Once the cast is finished, everyone within the targeting circle around the sword is one-shot. Normal run speed alone is not really enough to outrun this entire drag, but a speed totem from a shaman was pretty much perfect, and a stampeding roar would probably just be okay. Ultimately though, you can just use the wormhole. Instead of spawning it on the far side of the room, you can just put it within the area that the boss is dragging you into, and just before the cast finishes, you can just run into the portal and escape the AoE. Now people with a keen eye might be noticing that there are 2 other mechanics going on throughout this fight from start to finish. Under random players, the boss will spawn stasis traps. These activate after 4 seconds and last the entire fight, or until somebody runs into them. Doing so stuns you and makes you take ticking damage until you're freed by your raid attacking them. Having these spawn close to the wormhole is really bad for obvious reasons, so standing near enough to the wormhole so that you can react to all 3 of the different, or 4 if you're a tank, mechanics that ask you to use it is important, but not so close that traps spawn on top of or next to it and block people from using the wormhole. We decided to clear the traps using immunity rotations after 2 or so sets had spawned. But if you really wanted to, you could technically have your off-tank do them after he'd just returned from exploding away from the raid. It would however require your DPS to swap to the traps constantly to free that tank, which probably isn't ideal. The boss will also spawn rifts throughout the fight that target random players and send a beam down that line shortly afterwards, dealing a burst of damage. You just gotta simply avoid them throughout the fight. As for the Mythic version of this fight, it's nuts. Instead of replacing the previous mechanic at 70% and 40%, it instead just adds them to the fight. So at sub 40% towards the end of the encounter, you'll have the ads chasing you, seed bombs to place properly, and you've got to run away from the sword that will one-shot you if you're too close. On top of this, the fixate adds on Mythic were slightly slower. We're not sure if this is a deliberate difference between the Heroic and Mythic version of the fight, but we're guessing that it was a nerf to them on all difficulties because they were pretty speedy on Heroic. The ads on Mythic also, if they do possess you, it is permanent. You can't break the person out, so getting hit by one is essentially a one-shot as you can't be freed, unless you were killed and battle-resed afterwards. The amount of seeds to deal with on Mythic was 8, so the footage here will give you a good idea of how Heroic might look on live in regards to this mechanic, but we're guessing it will probably be a little bit easier. Either you have more time to move the seeds, or maybe they'll just have a slightly smaller radius. But either way, that is the fight. What are our thoughts?
So yeah, if it wasn't already quite obvious, I think it's safe to say that we really, really love this sort of fight.
Oh yeah.
It's not quite as common these days as it once was, but sometimes it just feels like Blizzard just adds random mechanics to fill like voids where they didn't quite know what to put in for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't know like what the theme of the fight was, or perhaps they just didn't execute the theme of the fight very well, and as a result you can just get a dungeon journal that's just filled with a huge list of mechanics, with the majority of them being, you know, not very important or just don't feel right for the fight. This is the complete opposite. They've clearly gone into this fight, they know exactly what the theme was of being able to teleport between 2 wormholes, and then they've just designed all the other mechanics to supplement that concept, and they've executed it really, really well. It's not groundbreaking by any means, nor is it the best fight we've ever seen or participated in, but not to shit talk the other fights in here, because for the most part they are fine, but they are very safe and at a pretty standard level of what you would expect from Blizzard in recent years at least. But this fight feels different. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like they've worked extra hard on it. And from everyone we've spoken to in and outside our raid team, everyone enjoyed it. I don't think there was a single person that had anything overly negative to say about the fight. And that applies to Heroic and Mythic. And as for Mythic, I think it could be insanely difficult on a mechanical level, as well as like working out the puzzle of dealing with all 3 major abilities towards the end of the fight. So I'm really looking forward to see how that plays out.
Speaking about Mythic, one thing that I do want to talk about is timers when you are transitioning between phases. When the boss gets sub 70% and now you've got both seeds and ads, I think it's very important that the timers entirely reset, because otherwise you might have a situation that if you push the boss at the wrong time, you'll get an impossible overlap. It seemed like they were doing that on Mythic testing, but one thing that it didn't really reset properly was with the tank debuff, so you might have the entire raid need to move through the portal as the tank gets the debuff at the same time, leading to some pretty nasty situations where it was like, should we just kill the tank and res them afterwards? So hopefully they can like maybe work out those little things, or maybe we're just getting unlucky. It is beta after all. But yeah, really looking forward to seeing how this fight plays out, because it's going to be insane on Mythic, I'm sure.
But we'll leave it there for now, guys. Our Wowhead guide will be updated with any changes made to this fight, and as always, we'll have a live guide for this encounter whenever it hits live servers in a couple of months' time. So thank you very much for watching, and we shall see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.